Hello, everyone. Welcome to our YouTube live session on generative AI evaluation frameworks. I'm Kevin DeWalt from ProLego, and I'm joined by Justin, Ben, and Cam. So, why do you need an evaluation framework in generative AI? Because it's too easy to make minor prompt or data changes that break your application without realizing it. And when you start adding in data engineering changes, new models, agents, different users, on and on and on, optimizations, you might discover you're spending all your time troubleshooting and trying to figure out, like, why doesn't it work like it used to? An evaluation framework is analogous to a systems integration test in traditional software. It's a series of inputs, usually data sets or user prompts, and we'll show you some examples in a second, paired with a series of expected outputs. So you can make sure, hey, is everything kind of working like I would expect it? So today we're going to discuss how we're building an evaluation framework for a ground crew, the example project we're using for this step-by-step mini-series where we're showing how to build a new generative AI application from start to finish. Ground crew uses LLMs to understand and interact with our code base, the code base that we use for doing these YouTube videos. And our goal is to improve code maintenance, knowledge management, make it easier to onboard new engineers, provide documentations, and identify potential coding issues. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how we're building evaluation frameworks and why, and give you, I guess, the developer and the product team perspective. So first question, I kind of gave I guess maybe a project and a product management overview about an evaluation framework. Can one of you guys speak to it from a developer's perspective? How do you think about this in terms of your tools and how you work?
I think your integration test analogy was good. As you build a system and you tweak it, you want to have something that you can kind of keep coming back to understand whether you're breaking things or whether you're improving things, and also just having something that is quantitative. When you're developing something, I think if you can try to take a hard problem and reduce it to some kind of metric, even if that metric isn't quite right, it just gives you something to work towards, and then you can adjust the metric too. You can adjust how you're testing it, but it really helps to have something to compare your progress against, so you're not just sort of dinging around with the system.
Like iterate by feel, like we've heard people talk. Yeah.
Which is really easy to do, because I mean, especially if you're developing, we'll have like one or two questions that are go-to, and we maybe over-optimize to those questions if we don't have an evaluation framework or something to pull us back to a broader view of what's working and what's not.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I didn't even think about it from that perspective. So when you're, I guess it's almost like having a set of unit tests that are doing test-driven development, where you're like, hey, I'm going to modify this, modify that. I guess with prompts, because it's so easy to change. Change a comma, change this, like move things around. And I could see myself wanting to just ask the same questions over and over again. And hey, everything's working fine, not realizing that you just knocked out half your edge cases.
Mm-hmm.
Cam, did you have something you want to say on that, or should I didn't follow a question?
Yeah, I think also like an evaluation framework is the natural next step from what we were talking about like the past few episodes, where our first steps were just dinging around, as Ben was saying, with it and not getting any quantitative feedback from it. You're just trying to get a feel for is this going to work potentially, and is the solution going to be useful? And once you've like softly answered those questions, then you can quantify it with this.
So how, if you're, I guess you have a good point there, Cam, but you're in a development team. This is your first generative AI project. Maybe for somebody listening to this, when would you start building an evaluation framework? I guess you don't have to give me like an exact like time. It doesn't have to necessarily be right after release or before release to customers. Like, at what point do you kind of would you say, hey, now we need to create this extra component that we have to maintain? Now the juice is worth the squeeze, I guess.
I mean, I think, like Cam said, you want to have that initial sort of proof of concept phase, but then maybe as the system grows in complexity. So maybe you build a proof of concept and it involves just a small handful of prompts and an agent with 1 or 2 tools or something. But then as that starts to grow and you kind of add more and more features, you want to have something that you can easily run to sort of test everything. That's when you'd want to start. I think another place would be, when you're just building a proof of concept amongst yourselves as the development team, you might not need one. But when you want to start interacting with stakeholders, then you might want one. So you, especially if you're handing the application off to somebody like a subject matter expert to test themselves, then they might come back and say, okay, I found these cases that don't work and these cases that do work. What do you do with those? Now those are test cases that you can put into your evaluation framework.
Yep.
So you're not just taking their feedback, but there's a sort of a concrete artifact, a concrete place where that stuff is going.
Yeah, hearing you describe that, I know with like traditional software, the stuff is questionable utility, but you have these tests you can run. It's like how many lines of code have test coverage, right? So gives you an eyeball of like how much you covered it. But since all of the knowledge and the business logic are 99% of it is in the LLM, there's no way to do that. There's no way to say, oh, we're covering 90% coverage. It's just, what are you trying to do? Like, and so I would imagine at some point there'll be tools or best practices for figuring like, am I getting Justin's going to help me out here, but like eigenvalues of dimensions that cover all possible permutations. Like somebody's going to be doing a PhD on, evaluation framework, logic coverage or something.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I think with traditional integration or software integration tests, you have certainly a finite, even if it's a large number of inputs, and you can sort of sweep over the inputs to make sure that the software responds appropriately. But here, the input is natural language. So the input to the software into the LLM is essentially unbounded, essentially infinite. And so, as Ben was saying, I think it's useful to think of the evaluation set as a dynamic thing that you can grow as you get feedback from users, where you can adapt based on the usage of the application.
Yeah, and I imagine there's probably no best practices for doing it other than just judgment at this point and saying, look, yeah, my customer screams because it didn't do X, Y, Z. That's got to be in our evaluation framework. Because you're talking about an open-ended input and a non-deterministic output. So, I mean, it gets harder to do this. All right, so we're talking about this in the abstract. You want to show some code, Ben, and show us how you built it, since you're the one that built it?
Sure. And kind of like the rest of our project, this is still a work in progress and something that we're iterating on. So this isn't the only right way to do things. Or
I mean, you're telling me there's more than one way to do an evaluation framework?
Oh yeah. Okay. So we have a script that runs the evaluation.
Is it possible, Ben, to blow that up and just see that file? I think this is a little tiny. Whoa. Okay. All right. That looks better.
All right. Yeah. So we have a script, and I'll try to zoom in and out. So we have a script that's an entry point for the evaluation framework. Basically, we kind of instantiate all of the pieces that we use for our agent and tools, like we do in the main entry point for our program. So the just taking a step back, the ground crew program is a command line application that is an entry point, and then you interact with it by typing commands on the command line, and there's an agent that dispatches tools. So what the evaluation framework does is you run it with a configuration that specifies different tests, and those tests are applied to the different tools and to the agent itself. And then it produces kind of a report at the end.
Okay, I followed about half that. Let's keep going.
Okay.
I'm going to ask some more questions as we go through. So.
Yeah. So something that I introduced here in the evaluation framework is an abstraction called a system, which is kind of like the configuration or the set of things that sort of you need to run ground crew queries or tools on things. So for now, we're just building that system the same way that we do when we run the command line application. In the future, we could build alternate versions of the system with different LLMs or different configuration or different things that we could compare. So for now, we're just building one, but in the future, we could build more.
Okay, so that you have to run that to run the script that executes the evaluation framework. This loads everything that we need to run. Okay.
Yeah, you can just think of it as building all of the pieces that we need to do to solve the problem that we have. Then we're going to load these evaluation suites, and these are described in this YAML file. So we've been doing a lot of work with YAML recently because it's designed to be kind of human readable way to write configuration. So here we have a bunch of suites, and each suite can have multiple tests, and each test describe a tool and parameters that we want to put into, and then how we're going to evaluate it. So this is designed to be human readable and editable apart from this program that would run the test.
Okay, let me just see if I can point out what I think is the key things on this YAML file, and you could tell me if I'm incorrect. So I think what we're doing here in that user prompt : is there functionality to extract text from a PDF? That is an example of an input prompt / question from a user of Ground Crew. And we want to ensure that the system returns the extract _text _ from PDF in the results. Is that it? Okay.
Yep. So there's a number of different evaluation functions that we have. Some of them are more heuristics. And then we also have the ability to use an LLM to do evaluation. We can talk more about that. And then I also have sort of a dummy evaluation function that just always returns true. So if you just want to run something and then look at the output, but you don't want it to necessarily fail because you don't have a good way to evaluate it, you can do that as well.
And so that's just to make sure like the code's working. Is that it?
Yeah. In some of these, I'm not sure the best way to test yet. So I just I think one of them, just trying to see if I feel like at one point I was using So we have one of the tools or components of Ground Crew is generating doc strings. And when I was writing this, I couldn't think of the best way to describe whether a doc string was valid. I didn't really want to add another LLM call, so I just made the type always pass for now.
Okay. So that's just placeholder effectively. So you a better test. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So when you have like name and like tools, can you tell me, so there's like in this YAML file, this is the tools section of the evaluation framework.
Yeah.
What does that mean? What are you testing with tools?
Okay. So and this name could really be anything, but basically these are just a bunch of tests for individual tools in the system. So the way Ground Crew works is there's the agent at the top where when the user answers a question, it kind of figures out which tool it should call and then calls that tool, which might also involve more LLM stuff. And then I have another section here that's tests for the agent. So I have kind of a capability in the evaluation framework to test the agent by giving it a sequence of prompts. So part of the functionality of the agent is that you can kind of have a conversation with it. So this allows testing that with a sequence of questions and then kind of looking at what comes out at the end.
Yes, I'll confess some of this, it gets a bit tough for me to follow because I'm not actually building a product because we have our existing code base that has tools and agents, right? And we're making Ground Crew, which is another code base with tools and agents to evaluate our code base that has tools and agents. So the tools that you're talking about, these are the Ground Crew tools evaluating the code.
Yep.
What is an example of a tool in Ground Crew?
So right now we
you scroll up. Yeah.
So we have 3 of them, I think, in the branch that I'm working on here. So we have a doc string generation tool, a codebase QA tool. So that's the general and ask a question about a function or a chunk of code in the code base.
Okay.
And then we have a linter tool as well, which is that not?
Can you tell me again what linting is? I always forget.
Oh, yeah. I'm not sure why that. Oh, yeah, there it is. Lint file tool. So linting is just, it's like, static checking for code. So
Okay.
checking for style issues, or it's basically you run a program on your source code and then it reports potential problems.
Okay.
So you can kind of think of these as sort of unit tests. So, we know we want to test particular tools, so we don't have to go through the process of making the agent figure out which tool we should use. We can just interact with that tool directly.
Okay, I see what you're doing here, but yeah, go ahead, Justin.
And speaking of unit tests, I'll call this out, and this is maybe a question as well, Ben.
Yeah.
We certainly do have unit tests, and I think what differentiates what goes into the evaluation that Ben is describing here versus unit test. If something is just code in the sense that it's deterministic, then we can and it's an isolated component of the code, then that's just a unit test. I think whenever a component or part of the code uses an LLM, whether it's the entire system or we're talking about tools, that's a part of the system that uses an LLM. And so it's non-deterministic. And so that's something that we would put here in the evaluation framework. Is that a good characterization, Ben?
Yeah. And I would take it one step further. Like even if the LLM was deterministic, we probably would kind of leave LLM calls out of our actual unit test just because they take a long time. And typically unit tests, you're kind of more trying to test logic, and you want them to run quickly and without using a lot of resources. So.
Okay, I tried to capture that in a pithy, quick summary, and of course I just made a typo, and now it won't let me edit the comment. But that is awesome, because I wasn't making the connection until you said it that way. So unit test, determination, evaluated for non-deterministic.
Non-deterministic and potentially compute intensive.
Compute intensive. Got it. Okay. All right. Anyway, you guys said it better than I typed it. So, okay, so these are evaluation framework that function as unit tests because you're using them to evaluate the performance of an isolated component within ground crew.
Yeah,
Okay.
Exactly. So going back to the code, we load our system, we load our evaluation functions, or we load our suites, and then we also build our set of evaluation functions. So these are the things like match word any, contains all, always pass, or build eval with LLM. So we can use these to sort of check certain things about outputs, and we could write more of these. These are just kind of the ones that that I've found helpful for evaluating output. So for example, match word any just checks if the like the output text of an LLM contains one or more of a list of words.
Okay.
And also does some stuff to like strip quotes. So the way we're using this is usually checking to see if an LLM output contains the name of a function or a symbol from code, and usually the LLM will, when it responds in its response, will put either like backticks or single quotes or double quotes around it. So this just splits the outputs into words, optionally strips the quotes, and then checks to make sure at least one of those words is present in the output.
Okay, so that's the evaluation.py file where you're just writing some Python functions to help you run the evaluation.
Yeah. So like for example, we're asking the question, is there functionality to extract text from a PDF? The LLM, we hope, would say something like, yes, in this file something.py, there's a function called backticks, extract text from PDF, right? So when we run this on it, if that's, this would match that result.
And so just, a few minutes ago, we were talking about non-determinism. And so I think it's worth calling out. This is exactly addressing that non-determinism, because the LLM in most situations is not going to always respond with the same thing. We need some rules or patterns to infer whether the answer from the LLM was correct.
Mm-hmm.
So then I guess as I'm, if I'm new to an evaluation framework and I'm trying to figure out like, all right, how do I get started going this and get the biggest bang for the buck? In my mind, it seems like for most like initial products, it's this, right? It is.
Yeah.
I'm going to feed it a prompt, and I'm going to look for a specific word out of it. So if I have a set of contracts, I'm building a contract classification system for my lawyers, and I can feed a contract in, and as part of that contract, it has it's, what is it? The cancel by date, or the starting date, or something like that.
Mhm.
I could say looks for June 1st, 2023, right? And just
Yep.
looks for that, and then it's a question of getting the formatting right, because there's multiple ways to, is it 6/1/23? Like, it's that. Okay.
Yeah. So like that there, for this function, you could put the different combinations of ways you might expect the date to show up, and then run the framework a few times and look at the output and see if there are valid cases that you're missing, right? Again, it's not necessarily a static thing while you're developing it. You can use this as a tool to help you understand the different ways the LLM might output things.
Okay, great. And so since our code is open source, if somebody wants to look at the function you've built, they can take a look at this, maybe copy some of the patterns of how to evaluate and how you're working through this. Great, Ben. This is helpful, because I think going through this, I get the basics of what you're doing. But it quickly gets more complicated.
So at a high level, it's actually not too much more complicated. I'm just running each of these test suites on the system with the eval function, and then or actually, so the running is here, the verifying is here. So I have a little set of functions that can verify that this is valid. So it just checks the things that can be checked as far as parameter names and making sure that this is formatted correctly. And then we run everything, store the results in a dictionary, and then convert it to a CSV. And then just to show what the CSV looks like, actually, let me just see here. This is it.
Is it possible to run it and let us look at the output?
Yeah, I've got example output here. So this is what the output looks like, and this is a little awkward to read. I have sort of a fudged formatting here so that it goes properly into CSV. You could build a nice, if you wanted to, you could use Gradio or something to build a nice viewer for this that would look better. But basically, we have the tests. There's functionality to run each test a number of times. So you can also, that's a way you can kind of deal with that non-determinism, is seeing how it performs over a number of times. You can see the runtime, and then whether the answer was missing. So sometimes, like if there's a exception or API error somewhere, it might be missing, and then whether it's correct or not based on the evaluation questions, and then the actual answer, so you can look at it.
So when you've shown me these outputs before, I thought that the answer part was really interesting, because sometimes I would see correct, false, and I read the answer. It's like, oh, actually, that's fine. That's the way. That's that's an okay answer. Because I mean, there can be edge cases where you're not catching every possible word. You can't necessarily do. I mean, true and false helps, but if you're doing this for the first time, you could probably just run it, look at the answers, and just say, hey, I got 20 questions, and what are the answers? Okay, this is kind of giving me what I need.
Yeah, and it's really easy to have little typos or misspellings in your like evaluation parameters. Like I was running this the other day and getting correct answers that looked wrong, and I had misspelled some of these imports that I was checking for. So it's good to look at the actual output for sure.
And I think it's also just, when I've been looking at how we did this in some of our other projects, in more traditional unit test, functional test, you got an error. Oh, that's bad. Go fix the error. But in some cases, I'll see something where it's like, okay, it's not actually correct, but all right, like if I was a user and I got that, what would I do? Well, I'd ask a follow-on question. It was almost like it was incomplete, but because of the nature of the product, it's like, okay, do I have to fix that now? Because if I saw that, I would just ask a follow-on question. Because I think one example was I wanted to see the name of the account holder and how much was in their account. And then it just gave me the name of the person. I'm always like, well, how much is in Joe's account, right? Like, I'm not gonna. It's not a catastrophic failure if it's incomplete. Now, if it gave me Mary the wrong account, then
yeah, and it's important to look. I mean, you know, and think about how these tests work, because you know, you could have, you know, like you're asking a question that you know, the answer is like multiple people's names, right? Maybe it gets some of them, but not all of them. Or maybe it gets all the ones that you're asking for, but also reports extra, you know? So yeah, evaluation is tricky, and there's no real good, like, one size fits all solution. So it's important to look at it and understand what's going on.
And if I think about some of the other projects we've done, it's often more efficient, especially if you have like a busy business customer. Like, any business customer is going to give you feedback as an expert, and they're always busy. So there's not like there's no valuable business customers who are sitting around twiddling their thumbs. You can give them an interface and say, hey, play around with it, see what you come up with. But that puts a lot of the onus on them. You could also generate, hey, here are 30 questions and here are the answers. Can you open up this spreadsheet and look at this and say, you know, and leave some comments, notes like, yes, no, that sucks. You know, that works well. I can see why that would be a lot more effective. And then you could have them write out questions, I guess, like, what are the other things we need to be checking? And they can help you write the evaluation framework as well. Yeah, this is, I think what makes this harder than traditional, like, writing, like, testing software, of course, has always been hard, right? And people work on PhDs on software, ensuring software is accurate, and there's companies built around it. This is even harder because it would involve so many different people, right? Like, you can imagine the product manager or the business customer is just going to be writing these, and they're interacting with effectively another application where this is how they're training the model. All right, I'm rambling now. Somebody else say something more exciting. This is
it's a general challenge with machine learning projects, and LLMs are amazing and magical, but they don't make that go away, right? You still have to have a way of evaluating your system somehow to know if you're actually solving the problem.
Yeah. And I guess it's also worth pointing out here, I've mentioned this on some of our other videos, but I mean, this is a project that we picked that we knew was going to be challenging. It would force us to go and force you guys to work on more complex things. The complexity and ground crew, this is not your first or second generative AI project. Like, this is not where you want to start, because you guys have already, you know how agents work, what they can do, what they can't do, how to use Python functions and variables and scratch pads. So you've got a lot of, I mean, this is a year's worth of experience doing this to be able to get to this point to work on something like this. Anyway, I'm just putting that out there for anybody who's watching this and going, oh my God, this is really complicated. Like, this is not, this is not the project you take up in your first 2 weeks of generative AI programming.
Yeah.
All right, Cam, Justin, I'm rambling and asking Ben questions. What have I not brought up? Do you think that's important for the audience?
I mean, I think we've covered a lot. I mean, a lot of what we've discussed is in my opinion, is like we talked about, dealing with the non-determinism. And so we've seen how Ben has, captured several ways for assessing inferring whether an answer is correct. That's a tricky part, especially if you're writing it down in code like we have, like Ben has. That's a big thing, other than also, again, regurgitating, reiterating what we've already talked about, but just seeing it as a dynamic thing. So, add questions and answers as you discover what the user is actually using the application for.
Yeah, I think the non-determinism is one of the biggest things, because at least for myself, that's something that I'm used to. Is being able to set a seed and getting the same output given the same input from a machine learning model. But for some of these, it's just not the case.
An interesting thing that we haven't talked about yet, but you mentioned briefly, I believe, Ben, is using an LLM to decide if the output from another LLM is correct or not.
Yeah.
You have experience with that?
Yeah, so this is something that I've only started looking at, and the example in here is kind of a toy example in the fact that it's just so general, but it could be useful. So let's see here. So I've got this build eval with LLM. So the way this evaluation function works is you give it an LLM, and our LLM abstraction here is just a function that takes a string and returns a string. So you can think of it as a prompt or whatever, and then whatever it outputs is the result. So, to evaluate something with an LLM, we have the text output, right? And then we have instructions that we use for evaluation. And then we just build this prompt where we have the text and the instructions, and then say your task is to evaluate the above text given the instructions. If the text satisfies the instructions, answer yes. Otherwise, answer no. So an example of using something like that would be, instead of looking for the specific extract text from PDF without quotes or whatever, you could just ask an LLM and say the result should reference the function extract text from PDF, right? And then that would be robust to different formatting things. Maybe you'd get a little bit more accurate evaluation here, since you're saying like it should reference a function. So like if it reported this but called it a class or something instead of a function, this might trip that. So like this particular example, I think it's kind of a toy example and a little bit overkill, but certainly for a more complex type of question and answer, I think this could be useful.
What came to my mind was what Kevin mentioned earlier. If you're expecting, let's say, a date time as part of the response, there's so many ways to write dates and times that rather than trying to anticipate every format that date time could appear in, just say, well, here's what the application produces an answer, then ask an LLM, is this actually the date time that I'm looking for? And it can sort out the formatting issues.
Yeah. And then, of course, though, I mean, LLMs are getting really good, but you're also assuming that your LLM is going to be able to do that task correctly. Because if something trips it up, then you might have an incorrect answer from that. So there's a little bit of a trade-off.
Sure.
Ben, can you go back to the that prompt you're using, saying like your task is?
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out, since it's I think sort of not easy, but like straightforward for us now, something that what Kevin was saying, like this isn't your first project after working with these for a week. Just the prompt that you put in there, like your task is to do this and that. There's a lot of I don't know what word to use, but like that prompt was crafted right, specifically. You use the phrase your task is to.
Yeah.
Little things like that, at least I've seen, go a long way.
Yeah, this is something that probably would work really well too in a variety of LLMs. Like you might be able to just throw anything at GPT-4 and it would answer well. But I haven't tested it yet, but my guess is that this probably would work pretty well even on some open source LLMs because of the sort of nice formatting.
Yeah, the hashtags, just everything about it.
Yeah, this is the kind of stuff I know, and I've done videos about this in the past, where just the slight wording difference on something like this in a prompt as instructions can result in radically different results. And unfortunately, I don't know of another alternative other than reading about what other teams are using, taking it with a huge grain of salt and trying it yourself, because we've read papers that have it, and here's the best way to do XYZ, and we throw it in there and it doesn't work.
OpenAI does have a list of best practices for prompts.
Okay, for their models.
For their models.
Right. So,
again, I think it this is the value of having an evaluation framework and having, aside from just an evaluation framework, having a list of like questions and expected answers, or questions and heuristics that get at what the answers are, because when people say, oh, you should be doing it this way, you can actually test it and see whether it works better instead of just wondering, right?
Yeah.
Or just dinging around with it and seeing, oh, maybe this works a little bit better. You have something, even if it's not extremely complete, you have some objective way of measuring these things.
Yeah.
So I look at the layers here. So we have source code that's non-deterministic in Neo-Sophia that we're trying to evaluate. So we're building a non-deterministic system to evaluate and using it. And then we're building on top that a non-deterministic system to make sure that system is evaluating this system correctly. It's like, my God, this is you guys are killing me here. I can't keep track of what's what. I'm sorry, Justin, I cut you off there. You're going to say something more interesting than my snide remarks, but
I was going to say maybe perhaps this goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. I mean, going back to the question of why do we need evaluation? There's a lot of the challenges, but especially if you're using a service like OpenAI that periodically update their models, you need to know if their updates are affecting you. So what do you have control over and what don't you have control over? Well, that's something you don't. And so you want to be able to evaluate how performance changes, if it changes from one model update to the other on their side.
And we may discuss this before, but my impression from some of our conversations and your feedback is there is some of their changes are not always published, and it will come in one day. Model's not working as well. Maybe they found some problem and overnight had to put in some safety, guard lines that changed how the neural network processes data, and suddenly things don't work anymore. Which again is another reason why open source may be a better option for people that need tighter control over their projects, because you have the LLM and you can build a system out there and control when you update. You don't have that kind of control with OpenAI. I mean, I know they publish versions. I never heard of them saying they get backwards compatible. I've never heard them mention that. Maybe that's true now. But I've also said, as I mentioned, that there seems like there are changes that happen between those updates that they don't tell you about.
And they do phase out old models too. So there was kind of a stink a couple months ago because they phased out one of the early versions of GPT 3.5. And that was a model that a lot of people were still using for LLM research as a baseline, right?
Yeah.
So now all of a sudden that's gone. There goes one of your baselines, right? You can't ever use that anymore on new questions or anything.
Well, guys, I think we've scratched the surface. I'd like to say we've covered everything about evaluation frameworks, but I think we are in the same position as everybody else and just trying to figure this out as we go. Anything that we didn't cover would be important for people to understand who are new to this or maybe working on an evaluation framework. Anything else you want to impart?
Yeah, one thing quick. A lot of what we talked about as far as the different aspects of the system that we're testing, we talked a lot about prompts for LLMs, but it's important to point out too that a lot of what is being tested here is also, if you think of this as kind of a RAG application, we're testing the retrieval part too, right? So like the codebase QA tool, right? You give it a question, it finds the matching chunk of code, puts it into a context, asks the LLM. With this evaluation framework, the recall or the retrieval part is also getting run. So that could also be something that you're experimenting with, maybe changing your method for summarizing the code and changing your embedding function that you're using with ChromaDB. That could also all be things that affect the system and how the evaluation results play out. So there's more to it than just testing your LLM.
Okay, just when I thought I had the basics, you got to throw in the complexity. Thanks, there, Ben. Hey guys, this was great. And I guess we're going to the deep end of the pool in this one, but I think it's important for people to understand it. For a lot of the projects that I talk about on the videos, at basic, automated document processing, basic RAG, you could probably get pretty far with some simple evaluation frameworks that check for words that don't require the level of complexity that we have in this one.
If you just need something really quick, I mean, I think you could distill everything down to maybe you have a spreadsheet of questions, have the LLM answer all those questions, even if you need to go through it by hand and eyeball it your first couple of times through, or maybe if you're not particularly coding savvy and you don't feel like you have to write a big application to do the evaluation. I mean, just getting started, as long as you're asking the same questions and making sure that you're getting the right responses, do that in a systematic way, even if it's a little bit manual, that'll be useful.
That's what Guy Savant did on the Verikit case study. Just opened up Google Sheets and he just cut and pasted. I mean, he could have developed a bunch of code, but it was quicker. It worked for him and he did it part-time. So this was not it would have probably taken him longer to build the code to do it than it would be just to cut and paste a series of prompts.
And he probably learned a lot from doing it manually too, like actually looking at everything. It's easy to build these big abstract applications where you push a button and a score comes out and not understand what's going on.
Yeah, for sure. All right, guys. Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody who joined us, and we'll catch you at the next live stream.